we're going to talk about your central nervous system. Central nervous system consists of your brain and your spinal cord. So let's look at the brain first. Now if you look at a brain, the most obvious thing about it is this top part with all the wrinkly tissue. That's called your cerebrum. That's actually got a few different names. Cerebrum, cerebral cortex, or sometimes just cortex. And that part of the brain is very much more developed in human beings than it is in other animals. And that's really why we're smarter than other animals, because of the development of the cerebral cortex. Now, the stuff kind of at the bottom of the brain, outside here, this is really not that much more developed than in other animals. Okay, this stuff really controls, basic functions, breathing and heart rate and coordination of muscles and unconscious things, basically, whereas the cerebral cortex is more involved in consciousness. So let's start talking about the brainstem, or the bottom of the brain. The very bottom of the brain, what's almost like the junction between the brain and the spinal cord, is called the medulla. It's actually called the medulla oblongata, but medulla is just fine. And like I said, it's right at the bottom of the brain, kind of the junction of the spinal cord. And this is, has pretty much the same function in all animals. This controls things that you don't have to think about. Breathing rate, heart rate, blood pressure. So when you start to exercise, you notice that after a while you start to breathe heavy, and that's because of the action of the medulla. And again, you don't have to think about it. It happens automatically. Just opposite the medulla, you have this small thing that kind of looks like the cerebrum, that sticks out at the back. This is called the cerebellum. The cerebellum is another part of the brain that deals with unconscious activity. Specifically, it deals with the coordination of muscle activity. So it doesn't control the muscles per se. It doesn't tell the muscles to move. That comes from the cerebrum. But what it does do is it coordinates the movement of muscles that are working together. So if you think about how many muscles are involved in just walking down the street, there's several muscles in your legs and your arms and everywhere. The coordinated action of all those muscles is controlled by the cerebellum. Some other parts to point out. We've got the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. And from previous studies that these two are involved in the endocrine system, releasing hormones. Other things, you notice the pons. The pons doesn't have a main function. It's just sort of a relay center, kind of sticks out at the front there. And the thalamus also doesn't have a main, really important function. It's also just sort of a relay center. This corpus callosum, it's kind of hard to tell from this cross section, but it has an important job. The corpus callosum connects the two halves of your brain. So if you look straight onto the brain, you'd see a left side and a right side, and they're connected by the corpus callosum. All right, so we're going to talk more about the cerebrum, because it's the cerebrum that really is, sets us apart from the other animals. So let's take a look. Now the cerebrum is divided up into 4 lobes, or 4 parts, and each part has sort of its own functions. So let's start with the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe, as the name suggests, is located right at the front of the brain. Now this is the part of the brain that controls your thinking. So logical thought. This is where your personality is based. And on top of that, you can see right at the back of the frontal lobe, but it's still part of the frontal lobe, is the motor cortex. What's that? That is the part of the brain that tells your muscles to move. So now I'm telling my finger to move. That is originating in the primary motor cortex. So that's the job of the frontal lobe. We have personality, we have intelligence, we have motor activity. Next, let's move down to the side of the brain. Let's talk about the temporal lobe. Located, as you would imagine, kind of right behind your temples. Temporal.
Richard Palmer. Palmer, can you please see Ms. Bellingham in our office immediately? Thank you.
So anyway, the job of the temporal lobe, the main job of the temporal lobe, is to deals with hearing. So it takes nerve impulses from your ears and turns them into meaning. Okay, so temporal lobe, located right by where your ears would be, controls hearing. Next, let's move to the top of the brain, where we have the parietal lobe. Main job of the parietal lobe is that it receives information from your senses, specifically touch. So information from your skin, so if someone pokes you, that information will travel up the neurons to your parietal lobe, and your parietal lobe will make sense of what that motion is. Okay, so the parietal lobe is touch. Last lobe we have right at the back. This is the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe's job primarily is to deal with vision. So it receives nerve impulses from your eyes, and it turns those light images into some kind of meaning in terms of what you see. All right, so that's the brain. Now let's talk about the other part of your central nervous system, your spinal cord. This is one section of your spinal cord. And notice that along each section of your spinal cord, 2 nerves come in from each side. So one from your left side of the body, one from your right. And I also want you to notice that each spinal nerve that comes in, when it gets to a certain point, it forks. Okay, one half of the nerve comes in at the top or dorsal side, and one half goes in at the bottom, which is the front or ventral side. Important to note that the back side, the dorsal side, is sensory information. So sensory neurons come in and they'll go around to the back door. Now the front door, or the front side, or the ventral side, this contains motor neurons. So when you're telling your muscles to move, that information is going to leave the spinal cord, come out the ventral route, down the spinal cord, down the nerve to your muscle telling it to move. So if we think about it, if you were in a, God forbid, in an accident and you damaged or cut that part right there, well then sensory information from that part of the body would not be able to get to your central nervous system. So someone could be poking you and you wouldn't know it. On the other hand, if this was just fine, but we broke a section down here, someone could be poking you, you'd be aware of you being poked, but you would not be able to move the muscles in that part of the body. Okay? One other important part to note, if we look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, we'll see gray matter and white matter. What's the difference? White matter consists of myelinated neurons. It's the myelin sheath in the neurons that causes it to appear white. So white matter is myelinated neurons, gray matter is unmyelinated neurons.